There are 10,000 ways to die in the 41st millennium, but on a hive world under imperial rule, you learn to live with death before you learn to speak. Every breath tastes of rust and ash. The sun has not touched the ground in centuries, choked out by smoke stacks that belch black poison into a sky already dimmed by orbital debris. In the Imperium, this is life. And for many, it is not worth calling life at all. I speak not as a soldier of the Emperor, nor as one of his chosen warriors clad in ceramite, but as a common man, a cog in a machine so vast that my name, my deeds, even my death, will not be remembered. To be a citizen of the Imperium is to surrender oneself entirely, to become fuel for the endless wars that rage across the stars. Some worlds give their tithes in soldiers, others in or grain. My world gives all three, and still it is never enough. The hive rises around me like an iron tomb, kilometers of ferrocrete stacked with human misery. At its base lies the sump, a black sea of toxins where the poor scrape what life they can from waste. Above that are the habstacks, endless warrens of steel corridors and decaying walls where families huddle in the dim glow of lumen strips. Higher still, manufactoria pounds ceaselessly, the clang of machinery echoing like the heartbeat of a god that has long since abandoned his children. At the very top, out of reach of smoke and dust, the spires stretch toward the polluted heavens, where governors, nobles, and priests live in guarded splendor. We below see only their shadow. The occupation is not new. My planet has long been part of the Imperium, but recently, its grip has tightened. The Astra Militarum, the Imperial Guard, has swelled its presence here. Armored columns roll through the avenues. Vox speakers blare sermons from the ecclesiarchy, promising salvation through obedience. Those who whisper dissent vanish, some into the bowels of the Arbeits precinct, others into thin air, as if the planet itself swallows them whole. We know better. The Imperium does not tolerate questions. I remember the day the new commissar arrived. The hive fell silent as his chimera rumbled across the plaza. He stepped out in his greatcoat, black as night, his peaked cap shadowing eyes that seemed to see into the marrow of every soul present. He spoke only one sentence, but it was enough to remind us all of what occupation truly meant. Disobedience is heresy. Heresy is death. The banners of the Aquila hang heavy from every building, but they do not inspire hope. They remind us of what we are, property, to be consumed for the glory of the Imperium. To live under occupation is to feel the gaze of the Emperor, not as the warmth of divine light, but as the weight of endless judgment. Still, we endure. Endurance is the only rebellion left to us. In the manufactoria, men and women work until their lungs fail, smelting or into lasgun barrels destined for faraway wars. In the Habs, children whisper tales of angels with steel wings, Astartes, though none have ever seen one. And in the shadows, some whisper other stories, darker ones. They speak of freedom, of throwing off the imperial yoke. But everyone knows where those stories end. The Arbeits do not need evidence. Whispers are enough. On my 29th year, I saw a boy beaten to death by Arbeit shockmalls because he dropped his ration shit. He had been hungry, too weak to hold it. The crowd watched, silent, because to speak was to invite the same fate. I felt sick, not only with rage, but with shame, shame for doing nothing, for being nothing. That shame has never left me. Even so, the hive is not without life. There are markets, dim and cramped, where scavenged tech and bootleg amasec change hands. There are shrines where priests of the ecclesiarchy scream their sermons until their throats bleed, urging us to embrace suffering as holy. And there are the gatherings, secret, fleeting, where neighbors whisper hope to one another in voices barely above the hum of power lines. Hope is dangerous here, more dangerous than any weapon. From the spire, the governor declares that we are fortunate. Fortunate to serve, fortunate to live under the emperor's banner, fortunate to die in his name. And perhaps he believes it. Perhaps he has never seen the sump, never smelled the rot, never watched a child claw at the air for breath that will never come clean. The spire and the sump are different worlds, but both live under the same occupation. The difference is that those above do not feel the boot pressing down. When the Vox speakers crackle at dawn, we rise. When the klaxons blare at shift change, we march. When the Arbeits patrol, we lower our eyes. This is survival. And survival is all we are allowed. But even in the deepest dark, seeds of change take root. The hive remembers. It remembers every ration withheld, every family disappeared, every public execution that painted ferrocrete walls with blood. A world can only endure so much before endurance itself becomes rebellion. And though I do not yet know it, my story is about to be consumed by that rebellion. For now, I walk the same path as always, through corridors slick with condensation, past vox speakers buzzing with sermons, into a manufactorum where the air is thick with burning metal. But as I step onto the line, I notice something strange. The vox is silent. For the first time in my life, the Emperor's voice does not thunder from above. The hive shudders with quiet unease. And in that silence, something stirs. The vox silence did not last long. Within minutes, the speakers screeched back to life, but something was wrong. The usual chants of obedience and sermons of the ecclesiarchy were gone. Instead, a single message repeated, distorted, almost broken. Hold fast. Glory to him on terror. Obey. 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 The words fractured into static, as though the machine spirit itself resisted. The foreman barked at us to return to work, his voice hoarse from years of screaming over clanging machinery. Last cutters whined. Sparks lit the dim cavern of the manufactorum. But no one forgot that silence. A silence like that meant weakness. And weakness meant danger. That same evening, the Imperial Guard arrived in force. Chimeras growled down the causeways, their tracks grinding grime into the ferrocrete. The Guard were not new to our world, but their numbers had swelled overnight. Whole platoons marched through the hive's arteries, faces hidden behind rebreathers, last guns gleaming with oil. To the nobles, their presence was reassurance. To us below, it was suffocation. The Guard did not speak to us. They did not need to. Their armor and discipline spoke loudly enough. Each step was a reminder. We were cattle, watched by the Emperor's hounds. A mother pulling her child too slowly from their path was shoved aside, her body crumpling against the wall with a crack that made me sick to hear. The guardsman never broke stride. Behind them came the vox trucks, setting up new towers, their antennas clawing at the sky. The sermons blared louder now, more insistent, as if to erase the earlier glitch. The Emperor is all. The Emperor is mercy. The Emperor is wrath. That night, from my hab window, a slit of rusted metal barely wide enough to see the hive's inner walls, I watched the guards set up checkpoints. Barricades of razor wire and steel choked the causeways. Auspex scanners glowed red as they swept across workers returning from the manufactoria. Those pulled aside did not return. We learned quickly. Papers always ready. Eyes always lowered. Silence in the lines. The commissar's law hung over us like the sword of a god. I still remember the first execution. It was public, deliberate. A man accused of hoarding rations, though everyone whispered it was because he spoke ill of the guard. The commissar himself read the charges. His voice was smooth, controlled, almost gentle. Then, without hesitation, he drew his bolt pistol and fired. The man's chest became red mist. The sound of it echoed through the plaza long after his body fell. The commissar turned to us, his face unreadable beneath the shadow of his cap. This is mercy. For you. For him. Mercy through purity. None of us moved. None of us breathed. Afterward, work continued as though nothing had happened. That is the way of the hive. Death is not interruption, only punctuation. But something had changed. The guard were no longer just enforcers of tithes and quotas. They were occupiers. And with them came fear sharper than any blade. One evening, I passed through a checkpoint on my way back from the manufactorum. The Auspex scanner chirped as it passed over me, its green light flickering strangely. The guardsman leaned closer, visor hiding his expression. He held my gaze, or at least, the dark reflection of it in his lenses, then waved me on. My legs carried me forward, but my heart hammered so loud I thought it might burst. I did not know what the machine had seen. I still don't. But I knew enough. The Imperium misses nothing. Even a heartbeat out of rhythm can draw suspicion. That night, my neighbor did not return home. His hab was sealed with an Arbeit sigil, warning death to any who disturbed it. His wife sat outside for hours, silent, as though waiting for permission to scream. By morning, she was gone too. The hive shifted. Conversations grew quieter. Markets emptied sooner. People walked faster, heads lower, as if shadows themselves carried ears. The occupation was not a sudden storm. It was a tightening noose, pulling thread by thread. Yet, in the darkest corners, I saw something else. Graffiti scrawled in blood and ash, words hurriedly smeared before Arbeit's patrols found them. The emperor is blind. Freedom is truth. We rise soon. I never touched them. Never spoke of them. But I memorized every one. Because the more the guard pressed down, the more the hive seemed to breathe differently, heavier, as though beneath the weight of something coming. The morning the commissar's law was demonstrated again, the hive felt colder than usual. Maybe it was the way the lumen strips flickered, or the silence in the hab corridors as I made my way toward the plaza. People were gathering there, pressed tight against one another, herded by guardsmen with shock batons and blank visors. I had seen this ritual before, but never so close. The accused was already waiting. A young worker, no more than 19, his hands bound, his face bruised from interrogation. They said he had defaced an Aquila banner, tearing it down from a manufactorum wall. No one could prove it. No one ever could. But accusations in the Imperium do not require proof, only belief. The commissar stood tall beside him, coat immaculate despite the ash in the air. His voice was clear, sharp enough to cut through the murmurs of the crowd. Heresy begins with doubt. Doubt leads to rebellion. Rebellion leads to death. This man doubted the emperor's glory, and in doing so, spat upon the Imperium itself. The boy shook his head, tears streaking the grime on his face. He tried to speak, but the butt of a lasgun slammed into his stomach, folding him in half. The crowd flinched but stayed silent. Always silent. The commissar drew his bolt pistol. The weapons machine spirit purred with terrible hunger, its casing inscribed with purity seals. He placed the muzzle against the boy's forehead. Let this be instruction. The Imperium forgives nothing. The execution was swift, brutal, and final. A crack like thunder echoed across the plaza as the boy's head ceased to exist, scattered into the air. His body toppled, twitching once before lying still. The guardsmen dragged the corpse away. The plaza reeked of ozone and blood. I did not move. I could not. My stomach churned, bile clawing its way up my throat. But worse than my nausea was the part of me that felt relief. Relief that it wasn't me, that the bolt pistol hadn't chosen my skull. That shame burned hotter than any flame. The commissar turned his gaze over the crowd. I swear his eyes stopped on me for half a second. My knees almost buckled. Then his voice cut the silence again. Discipline is mercy. Mercy is loyalty. Obey, and you will be spared. The crowd dispersed like smoke. Conversations hushed, footsteps hurried. No one wanted to linger near the stain on the ground. That evening, in the hab corridors, whispers passed like contraband. Some said the boy had been innocent, others that he was indeed a heretic. What mattered was not truth. Truth has no place in the Imperium. What mattered was fear, and fear grew heavier with each execution. But in fear, I saw something else stirring. Not open defiance, no one was that foolish, but a kind of quiet desperation. I caught sight of it in the eyes of a mother clutching her daughter tighter than usual, in the way an old man refused to look at the Aquila carved above his door, in the scrawled graffiti erased by Arbeits only to return the next morning. The guard thought fear would keep us silent. They did not understand. Fear is a fire. And fire spreads. The manufactoria worked longer hours now. Rations were cut smaller. Vox speakers screamed sermons day and night, their voices raw with zeal. Arbeits patrols smashed into habs at random, dragging out whole families. The hive was not living anymore. It was choking. One night, I passed through a choke point where a guardsman checked every worker with an auspex. The scanner beeped red as it swept over a woman in front of me. She froze, clutching her child. Without a word, two guardsmen seized her by the arms. The commissar appeared, almost like he had been waiting. His bolt pistol rested against her skull before the child could even scream. I turned away. I had to. But later, in the silence of my hab, I remembered the child's wail. It echoed in my ears long after it ended. That sound was something the commissar could not erase. The law of the Imperium was clear: obedience or death. But even as I tried to swallow it, I began to wonder if perhaps there was a third path, though to imagine such a thing was treason itself. Still, when I lay down to sleep, I could not shake the thought. And deep within the hive shadows, I swore I could feel something watching. Not the Emperor. Something else. Ration day. The only day when the hive stirred with a kind of frantic energy, though there was no joy in it. People lined the avenues for kilometers, pressed shoulder to shoulder in suffocating silence. The smell of unwashed bodies, rust, and hunger hung thick in the air. Mothers clutched children close, old men leaned on makeshift canes, and everyone waited for their share of nothing. The Arbites patrolled the queues, their carapace armor gleaming dully beneath lumen strips, their shock mauls ready to crack skulls at the slightest disturbance. Above us, the great vox speakers droned the same hollow words. The Emperor provides. The Emperor protects. Gratitude is obedience. But the rations were never enough. When my turn finally came, the servitor behind the counter clanked forward, its flesh sagging in grotesque patches where steel had replaced what nature had abandoned. Its vox grill spat static as a mechanical hand dropped a tin of corpse starch into mine. The paste was grey, tasteless, and foul, but it was food that might stretch 3 days if I was careful. The woman behind me was not so lucky. Her chit was marked defective by the machine spirit of the cogitator. She begged, voice cracking, swearing she had paid her tithe, but the Arbites did not care. 2 of them seized her arms, dragging her out of line as her children screamed. The servitor never paused. The next tin dropped into my hands as if nothing had happened. No one moved to help her. We couldn't. To protest was to vanish. I carried my tin back through the hive's arteries, trying not to breathe too deeply of the smog that pulled between hab blocks. The hunger in my gut twisted tighter. But worse than hunger was the knowledge that the woman and her children would not be seen again. Inside the hab, people sat cross-legged on the floor, waiting for the meager portions. I broke the tin open with a rusty knife and scraped out the corpse starch, dividing it into lumps. No one spoke. Eating was not pleasure, it was survival. Then, the vox crackled. Not the usual sermon. This was a new voice, sharp, commanding. The Adeptus Arbites, announcing new curfews. All citizens were to remain indoors past the second bell of night. Anyone found wandering would be considered a heretic. The room grew colder. Curfews meant fear was growing. Fear meant something was stirring in the hive. That night, as the second bell tolled, I stood at the slit window of my hab outside. The avenues were empty, save for Arbites patrols sweeping through the haze. Their mauls glowed faintly with crackling power. A child's cry echoed faintly from somewhere deep in the stacks, but it was cut short. And then, a sound unlike any I had heard before. From far below, in the depths of the underhive, a roar rose, distant but unmistakable. Not the roar of engines or machinery, but of human voices. A chant. A cry of defiance. It lasted only a few moments before last fire lit the darkness, cutting it short. The Arbites moved quickly, sirens wailing as chimeras thundered toward the lower levels. But I had heard it. And so had others. The next day, the queues were quieter, but the air was different. Beneath the silence, something buzzed. A dangerous energy. I saw it in the eyes of strangers, in the way people leaned closer when they whispered, in the tension of every drawn breath. The guard thought their curfews and executions would break us. But the hive was restless. And restless hives do not stay silent for long. That night, I dreamed of fire. Fire spreading through the sump, through the habs, through the manufactoria. Fire that no Arbites, no commissar, no regiment of guardsmen could extinguish. When I woke, the smell of smoke clung to the air. The smoke was real. It drifted in faint wisps through the manufactoria corridors the next morning, curling along the lumen strips like dying spirits. At first, I thought it was a machine fire, common enough, with overworked furnaces and neglected vents. But then the whispers started. The black ship has come. Fear spread faster than the smoke. Men and women exchanged quick, nervous glances, hands tightening on tools as if they might somehow serve as weapons against the inevitable. None of us spoke too loudly. The black ship was not a rumor to toy with. It was real. And when it came, it took. By midday, the rumors proved true. Through the slit windows high above the manufactoria, I saw it, a looming shadow in orbit, vast and silent, blotting out what little light filtered through the smog-choked sky. Its shape was monstrous, its hull inscribed with wards that shimmered faintly against the void. Even at that distance, its presence pressed on my skull like a weight, as though the ship itself was watching. The Arbites moved through the hive with a new ferocity. Patrols doubled. Checkpoints swarmed with guardsmen. And worst of all, the psycho hunters came. Men clad in hoods of black, faces hidden behind masks etched with burning script. They carried staves that pulsed with a strange hum, instruments of detection and suppression. They did not announce their purpose. They did not need to. Everyone knew. That night, the seizures began. The psycho hunters raided hab blocks, dragging men, women, even children into the streets. Some were screaming, others vacant-eyed as though already broken. Those who resisted were struck with blinding arcs of energy from the hunter's staves, convulsing before collapsing limp. The Arbites herded them into transports, which rolled toward the starport in grim silence. No one ever returned from the black ships. We all knew where they went, to Terra, to feed the Emperor's throne. Or worse. In my hab, we listened as distant boots thundered closer, stopping 2 levels below. My heart pounded against my ribs like a hammer. For a moment, I thought they had come for me. I dared not breathe. Then came the sound, a child screaming, shrill and terrified. Doors slammed, boots crashed, voices shouted. And then silence, broken only by the grinding of transport engines. The family below was gone. I could not sleep that night. The walls felt thinner than ever, as though the hive itself was porous and fragile. I pressed my palm against the metal and felt it trembling faintly, carrying the vibrations of armored transports below. The next day, the work lines were emptier. People gone, their places on the assembly lines filled by silence. The foreman shouted louder than ever, his voice cracking with fear as much as anger. But what haunted me most was the look in people's eyes. Hollow, vacant, like candles snuffed out one by one. The black ship had not just taken psychers, it had taken hope. And yet, in that hopelessness, something darker stirred. On the way back from the manufactoria, I saw graffiti scrawled in hurried strokes of red, "Better the warp than chains." It had been half-scrubbed by Arbites already, but the words still bled through. That night, I heard whispers in the corridor. A man and a woman, voices low, arguing. One spoke of fleeing into the underhive, of joining others who refused the tithe. The other wept, begging him to stay quiet. Their voices ended abruptly when boots clattered nearby. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hive breathe. For the first time, I wondered what I would do if they came for me, if some flicker of thought in my skull betrayed me as a psyker. Would I fight? Run? Or would I simply vanish, another name erased from the hive's memory? When dawn came, I still had no answer. But the shadow of the black ship remained. The days after the black ship's arrival blurred into one another, each one heavier than the last. The hive had always been oppressive, a tomb of iron, smoke, and endless toil, but now it felt suffocating. The air was sharp with fear, thick with suspicion. Neighbors who once traded ration slips now avoided eye contact, afraid that even a glance might mark them as different. The Arbites prowled like carrion birds, their armor polished to a hateful sheen, their mauls heavy in their hands. Even the manufactoria foreman spoke with a tremor, shouting louder than before to mask their unease. It wasn't just the seizures anymore. It was what followed. One morning, as we marched toward the line, we passed a scaffold hastily erected at the junction square. 3 figures dangled there, 2 men and a woman, their bodies limp, their faces purpled. A sign hung around each neck: heretic, traitor, unpure. The message was clear. The Arbites had begun their purge. That day, I worked in silence, the clanging of machines almost a relief from the silence in my head. Every strike of the press drowned out the memory of swaying corpses. Every hiss of steam smothered the whispers of rebellion. But the graffiti kept reappearing, painted in places the enforcers couldn't scrub fast enough. Better the warp than chains. The Emperor feeds on us. Free in death. The words wormed into me. I wanted to ignore them, to dismiss them as the madness of desperate men. But they clung, sticky and insistent, like smoke in the lungs. One night, returning to my hab, I saw them. A group of figures cloaked in rags, gathered at a junction where lumen strips flickered dim. Their faces were hidden, but their voices carried, low, urgent, filled with hunger. I froze in the shadows, listening. "We have seen the truth," one rasped. "The black ships do not save us. They consume us." Another voice, softer: "Better to turn to powers that answer, than to bow to chains that never break." My chest tightened. They were talking about them, the things in the warp, the whispers we were taught to fear above all else. Chaos, heresy, damnation. And yet, no Arbites stormed the junction. No alarms wailed. The figures scattered quietly, vanishing into the ducts and tunnels like shadows melting into dark. Only I remained, rooted in place, trembling with the knowledge that rebellion had already taken root. When I finally reached my hab, I could not eat. I could not sleep. I sat staring at the bulkhead wall, listening to the faint hum of power conduits, wondering what would happen when the rebellion no longer whispered but shouted. The next morning, I had my answer. As the work shift began, a klaxon wailed, not the usual one, not the shrill call to assembly or fire drill. This one was deep, guttural, shaking the walls. Men and women froze mid-step, confusion etched on their faces. Then came the explosion. A roar of fire and metal ripped through the manufactoria floor. The line shuddered. The air filled with dust and screaming. The scaffolding collapsed, burying dozens beneath molten steel and twisted machinery. Through the smoke, I saw them, the rebels. Cloaked figures wielding stolen lasguns and crude blades, their faces daubed with symbols I dared not name. They moved with fury, cutting down Arbeits before the enforcers could form ranks. One raised his weapon high and shouted words I could not hear, but the sound of them burned in my skull. The hive had cracked open. We were no longer prisoners of silence. We were prisoners of war. Retribution came faster than breath. The rebels' strike burned bright, but in the hive, nothing stays hidden for long. By the time the smoke from the manufactoria collapse had thinned, the Arbeits had sealed every exit. Sirens howled across the lower tiers, vox speakers booming proclamations of unlawful uprising, purge in effect. I saw it all unfold from the catwalk above the line. The rebels below screamed oaths against the emperor, their lasguns crackling, their blades stained with blood. For a moment, they seemed unstoppable, ordinary men and women finally unchained, their desperation wielded as a weapon. But then came the thunder. The arbitrators stormed in columns, their shock mauls sparking blue, their combat shotguns belching flame and steel. Where rebels fought with frenzy, the Arbeits fought with precision, every step measured, every round placed. They cut swathes through the mob, advancing inexorably. The rebels bled, and still they howled. And above them all, higher than the Arbeits, higher than the Havelock spires, descended the true hammer of the Imperium. The Space Marines had come. It was only a single squad, maybe 10 of them, black armor glistening with sanctified oils, their pauldrons marked with a crimson cross. Black Templars. I had only ever heard stories of Astartes, tales whispered in hushed tones to frighten or inspire. To see them in the flesh was to behold gods wearing armor, their presence drowning every other sound. The first Marine fired his bolter, and the manufactoria floor disappeared in gore. Each shot was an execution, tearing rebels into mist and ruin. Another waded into the mob, chains were roaring, cutting bodies as if they were stalks of grain. The rebellion did not break, it disintegrated. And yet, amidst the slaughter, something terrible stirred. One of the rebels, a man I recognized, a worker from the line who had once shared ration bread with me, threw down his gun and raised his arms. He screamed a name, a word that twisted the air around him. I felt it as much as heard it. The shadows moved. From the cracks in the manufactoria floor, from the darkness between the conduits, shapes emerged, things with too many eyes, too many teeth, too much hunger. Diamonds. Warp spawn. They poured into our reality like maggots through an open wound. The Arbeits faltered. Even the Templars paused, chains words dripping, bolters raised with new urgency. The hive had not just rebelled. It had invited. The clash became chaos in its truest form. Marines battling diamonds in the smoke. Arbeits firing into anything that moved. Civilians crushed in the stampede, their screams rising above the roar of bolters and the screech of chains words. I fled. I admit it. I ran through ducts and vents, the heat of burning promethium licking my back, the echo of inhuman shrieks chasing me deeper into the hive's bowels. My only thought was survival. But as I ran, I knew. The rebellion had been doomed the moment it began. The Imperium would not forgive this uprising, nor the summoning that followed. There would be no mercy. No rebuilding. We were no longer a hive under occupation. We were a battlefield. And battlefields do not have survivors. The purge spread like wildfire. When the Inquisitor arrived, the hive already lay half-shattered, its towers glowing with the embers of promethium and the blood of its own people. But an Inquisitor does not come for fires already lit. They come to find the spark, and crush it before it spreads. The Inquisitor's name was never spoken aloud to us. To the Arbeits, to the Guard, to even the administratum clerks, he was only Lord. He strode in a cloak of deep crimson, his rosette gleaming at his breast like a death sentence. One glance from his eyes seemed to peel flesh from bone. His retinue followed close, a psyker with chains upon her arms, a death-masked assassin, and a servitor dragging a weapon whose hum felt like judgment. We were summoned into the Hab Square, what was left of us. Survivors, refugees, laborers who had not yet fled or burned. The air reeked of ash. Above us, banners of the Aquila flapped in the thermal winds of still-burning Manufactoria. The Inquisitor's voice boomed through the Vox amplifiers. This world has sinned. No one spoke. The silence was terror itself. Some have welcomed the enemy. Others have turned from the Emperor's light. But none are free from suspicion. He raised a hand, and at his gesture, the Psycho girl's eyes rolled back in her head. A scream echoed, not hers, but 100 voices led at once. The air grew cold, as if the void itself had slipped into the hive. People clutched at their ears, blood trickling from nostrils and mouths. She pointed. A woman beside me shrieked. Before she could flee, the assassin's blade whispered, and her head rolled into the ash. Her children wailed, clinging to her fallen body, until last fire cut them down as well. That was the moment I realized, this was not an investigation. This was an erasure. The Inquisitor's gaze swept us like a searchlight. This hive will be cleansed. At that word, the guard marched forward, flame troopers priming their nozzles, Arbites loading fresh shells. Even the Templars, silent and implacable, seemed to loom larger, their presence sealing our fate. Somewhere in the crowd, someone snapped. A stone flew. Then another. Then a shout. Enough. The Inquisitor did not even blink. His hand rose. The Psyker screamed. The ground split open, and the first demon clawed its way free. It was then I understood the cruelty of Imperial occupation. Not merely the hunger. Not the lash. Not even the fear of execution. The true cruelty was this: there was no choice. Loyalty or rebellion, silence or defiance, all roads led to death. The hive became a charnel pit, a theater of slaughter dressed in holy banners. And still, somewhere deep in the ducts and catacombs, whispers promised that this was only the beginning. The Inquisition had come to save us. We would be lucky if anything was left to save. It began as a spark. In the ruins of a collapsed hab block, a child wept. She was no more than 10 Terran years old, her hair matted with soot, her hands blistered from clutching rubble that had once been her home. Her name was Lyra, and she should have been just another forgotten soul swallowed by the hive's ruin. But the Emperor, or perhaps the warp itself, had other designs. When the Arbites stormed the ruins in search of cultists, one of them raised a shock maul against the child's father, accusing him of heresy for failing to kneel fast enough. Lyra screamed, and the world screamed back. I saw it with my own eyes. Her cry rippled like lightning, hurling the arbitrator against the wall with such force his armor caved inward. Every lumen in the corridor exploded at once, showering glass. The air itself hummed, vibrating with raw psychic force. The Arbites panicked. They fired indiscriminately, striking stone and flesh alike. Her father tried to shield her, but last bolts cut him down in a heartbeat. Lyra's eyes glowed white. I will never forget the sound, a keening wail that wasn't hers alone. It was as if countless voices shrieked through her small frame, voices clawing to be heard. Blood streamed from her ears. Sparks crawled across her skin. And in that moment, the Arbites froze. Not out of mercy, but because the Inquisitor himself had entered the chamber. Take her. His voice was iron. His assassin moved first, but the Psycho girl in his retinue restrained him with a flick of her chains. The Inquisitor stepped closer, his rosette glinting in the fractured light. A weapon, he said, studying the child as one might study a blade's edge. Or a beacon. The guard dragged Lyra's limp form into custody, ignoring the cries of her surviving kin. Those who reached for her were executed on the spot, their bodies cast into the rubble. I could not move. My breath caught in my chest as I realized the truth. This was not a rescue. This was possession. The Imperium had claimed her. In hushed whispers later, the survivors argued. Some swore she would be sent to Terra, fed into the black ships, sacrificed to keep the Astronomicon alight. Others feared worse, that she would become the Inquisitor's tool, a sanctioned psyker to burn out the minds of countless victims. But one thing was certain, she was no longer ours. I caught a glimpse of her face as they carried her away. The glow had faded, but something lingered in her eyes. Not innocence, not terror, but awareness. She knew she was marked. And so did I. The purge was no longer just about stamping out rebels. With a psychochild at its heart, our hive had become a crucible, a testing ground for power. The walls shuddered with distant detonations, and I understood, the worst was still to come. The Emperor's mercy had just begun its cruelest work. Beneath the hive, the air was thick with mildew, ash, and the stench of too many bodies crammed into too little space. The upper tiers had become execution grounds, patrolled by Arbites and guard alike. Those who survived their sweeps fled downward, into the bones of the city, the catacombs, the forgotten maintenance arteries where light had not reached for centuries. That is where I found them. Men and women who had once been workers like me, manufactoria drones, guild serfs, ration scribes. They huddled in the dark beside rebels who had escaped the purge, their weapons rusted but still ready. Families clutched children to their chests. And further in, cloaked figures knelt before candles that guttered with colors no natural flame should burn. A dozen factions, all desperate, all hungry. Some wanted only to hide. Some wanted to fight. Some wanted revenge. And some, too many, wanted to serve. The cultists had been here longest. Their symbols daubed the walls in blood and ash, crude 8-point stars mingling with glyphs that crawled when I tried to look at them too long. They promised protection, food, safety. They whispered that the Imperium's cruelty proved the truth of their gods. And with every Arbite raid, every family dragged screaming into the night, their voices gained more weight. I listened. I wish I could say I turned away, but the words slid into my mind like oil, tempting, promising. The Emperor demands your death, they said, but the gods offer power. Still, there were others who resisted them. A man named Jorik, once a foreman, stood tall in the flickering half-light. His voice carried the strength of iron. We will not trade one tyrant for another, he spat, glaring at the cultists. We've lived under chains long enough. I'll not bend knee to diamonds. Some cheered, but most only stared, hollow-eyed. Hunger and fear dulled the will. The cultists smiled in silence, knowing time was on their side. The catacombs shook then, a thunderous impact from above. Dust rained from the stone ceiling. Far away, muffled screams carried through the tunnels. Prometheum. Another district burning. That was when the whispers grew louder. A voice rose above the rest, not Jorik, not a cultist, but a woman cloaked in rags, her eyes glimmering with faint warp light. The child, she hissed. The girl they took. She is the key. Through her, the veil has thinned. Through her, this hive will bleed stars. The words chilled me. All around, heads turned. Some faces twisted in awe, others in terror. I knew she spoke of Lyra. A decision was forming, like frost creeping across glass. Some wanted to free her, to claim her power for rebellion. Some wanted her destroyed, lest she drag the whole world into damnation. The cultists, of course, wanted her alive. I realized then that the true battle was no longer between rebels and Imperium, not even between survival and obedience. It was for the soul of that child, and by extension, for the soul of the hive itself. Jorik raised his last pistol high, his jaw clenched. Then we go up, he growled. Before they finish us in the dark. We fight not for the Emperor, not for their gods, but for our own. The crowd stirred. Some nodded. Some prayed. Some reached for blades. And somewhere deeper in the shadows, unseen, something laughed. The first flames rose at dawn. From the shattered windows of the catacombs, I saw the sky, if it could still be called that, lit in sickly orange. Entire